From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Julie Fine, I'm David Gura.
And tonight, the clock ticks down for the president to make a deal.
We're keeping a very close eye on what will happen with unemployment, what's going to happen with inflation, obviously, what's going to happen with the actual tariffs.
The world's business leaders gather and call for an end to the uncertainty over tariffs. The message Treasury Secretary Bessent delivered today, and what, if any, trade plan we could soon expect.
Plus, the new reporting on the significant disturbance that left radar and radio communication dark for more than a minute. We'll speak to Florida Congressman Bryon Donalds about that and more coming out of the White House.
Also tonight, the administration takes on a new approach as it seeks to carry out the president's promise of the largest deportation in U.S. history.
What doesn't help us at all is not focusing on bad actors, but going after children and their families indiscriminately at hospitals, schools, and at workplaces. That just creates fear and anger and animosity.
The new tool the Department of Homeland Security is now employing, and the president's response.
And Congress is back in Washington looking to pass Trump's budget and enact those promised tax cuts. Pennsylvania Democratic Congressman Brendan Boyle, the ranking member of the House Budget Committee, is going to join us to talk about what's at stake on the Capitol. We begin at the White House North Lawn with Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove as the President of the United States is in the Oval Office with members of his health policy team, signing a series of executive orders, one focused on biomedical research, another on domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing. Josh Wingrove, we'll start there if I could. This has been a busy afternoon for the President. There was this announcement about holding the NFL draft in Washington in 2027. Now we move on to the business of the day, these executive orders. What do they signal? What do they signal here that the President's signing?
Yeah, this is live, so the details are still kind of coming in. But as you mentioned, these are related to health. Now, one is about speeding up domestic manufacturing of like pharmaceutical drugs. This has kind of been an open question because remember that was one stream that Trump has been eyeing tariffs on, and it's been kind of unclear on when and how those will land. So he both signed this order today and hinted that they'll have some kind of announcement next week on drug pricing. The other one that you mentioned is about gain-of-function research. This has roots in the COVID pandemic. Remember, Trump has been pretty big on the question of that pandemic, starting with research in the lab in Wuhan. And this order, I guess, bans U.S. funding from going to any research project that's doing what's called gain-of-function research in China and other countries where the U.S. doesn't feel it would have appropriate oversight. Symbolic, certainly, to a certain extent, with Trump sort of musing today even that he doesn't think that the COVID pandemic would have happened were it not for this. Remember, they redid their entire White House COVID page to focus on the lab leak origin theory or the data that points to that. So that's where he's been on this. He also met behind closed doors with the ballerina who was freed from Russia in one of the most recent prisoner swaps. So that's your rundown. Been a day, been an afternoon so far. But he did take a lot of questions at that event with Roger Goodell and Mayor Bowser here in Washington.
And Josh, tomorrow a busy day as well. Newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney from Canada will also be at the White House. He essentially ran as a counter to some of President Trump's proposals. So what are you expecting there tomorrow?
There are a lot of open questions right now on trade between the two countries. I think that'll be in there. That'll be sort of the top focus on it. Remember, Canada and Mexico are not on those tariff regimes that almost every other country is on, that sort of baseline global tariff. And so some questions are, will they continue to exempt USMCA goods? What does that renegotiation that's expected to sort of begin next year of USMCA look like? And there are the things that could ratchet up. Remember, the thing that Trump announced over the weekend about trying to tariff movies, that would hit Canada as well. Howard Lutnick, just moments ago on Fox Business, sounding a pretty downbeat note about what he thinks will happen, said he thinks it's going to be an interesting event, kind of seems to suggest there'll be fireworks in this meeting. Prime Minister Carney really did get elected in many ways by sort of positioning himself as the one who could best counter Trump. He's, of course, the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. And so he wants to sort of, come in and look like he's managing the relationship to some extent. But lots of these things hanging in the air, including auto tariffs and steel tariffs as well.
Josh, thank you very much for that reporting. That's Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove at the White House for us on this Monday afternoon. And within the last hour, we got word from Ford. It's become the second big automaker to suspend its forecast this year, citing trade uncertainty. That as the president continues to push for rate cuts, while reiterating he does not plan to fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, despite criticizing him over and over and over again for not taking action. The next Fed meeting starts tomorrow. We'll get a rate decision on Wednesday. Joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg's Mike McKee. And Mike, let's just start with what to expect out of this meeting. My sense is things are going to stay fundamentally the same here, at least until the next one or the one after that.
I think you're going to be really bored by what the Fed comes out with on Wednesday because there's not much they can do at this point. The president still has a lot of explaining to do about who gets tariffed, how much they get tariffed, when the tariffs start, et cetera, et cetera. And until the Fed can put some of that into a model, they don't really know what's going to happen. So the best course for them is to just sit still. They're also not doing new forecasts for the economy at this meeting, nor are they doing a new dot plot. So there isn't much that's going to happen on Wednesday except for Jay Powell, his news conference, which I would imagine is going to be an exercise in saying, I don't know, about as many different ways as you can.
Hey, Mike, I want to ask you quickly about the Taiwan dollar that surged as much as 5%. What does that really have to do with the tariffs here in the United States, and how is the Taiwanese government reacting to this?
Well, it has a couple of things to do in an interesting situation because a lot of other Asian currencies have fallen lately because they're afraid of tariffs. In this case, the Taiwanese are worried that the president is going to require, or at least traders, I should say, are thinking the president may require them to weaken their currency, to strengthen their currency, rather, so that the U.S. dollar gets weaker. And that would improve the U.S. export position. But at this point, the U.S. dollar is already getting weaker. And at the same time as traders are wondering what's going to happen with this trade negotiation, a lot of life insurance companies in Taiwan have invested a lot of money in U.S. treasuries. And as the dollar gets weaker, their financial position gets weaker. And they are concerned about whether they will end up in any kind of a default situation. So that has people also moving in the markets. It's a complicated situation, and it really all kind of feeds back to the Trump tariffs.
Bloomberg's Mike McKee, we appreciate your time on this busy day. And air traffic controllers at one of the nation's busiest airports lost radar and radio communications for over a minute on April 28th, causing flight delays and cancellations. The incident led to a reduction in staffing and contributed to a week of disruptions at the airport. It's the latest in a growing list of disruptions to air travel. For the latest, let's turn now to George Ferguson of Bloomberg Intelligence. George, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
This has just been a very big problem that seems to be getting worse. Can you give us the latest on the situation?
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, even, right, we were having problems with New York and Florida flight control systems. And so, what this appears to be is that the FAA looked to move control of airplanes coming in and out of Newark to Philadelphia from a control center that was in New York, was in Long Island. And it appears that whatever systems they had, they thought they had redundant systems that would set up this communication between Long Island and the new center in Philadelphia that I sense probably had some excess capacity, at least the FAA thought. They had a problem with the system that was relaying information from Long Island, which was the old primary facility, and controllers at some point, it sounds like, lost communications or understandings of where airplanes were for over a minute. And I think it's stressed some of the employees out, and so I think they've sort of taken leave. They're not so much as dismissed as taking leave, but I think it just it highlights the problems we've been having in New York of understaffing and technology challenges, and now of course makes it worse when you lose people on the job.
George, thank you very much for that update. That's George Ferguson of Bloomberg Intelligence joining us from Princeton, New Jersey today. Well, coming up, House Republicans are continuing their work on the tax and budget bill. We'll discuss how the minority side is preparing with Democratic Congressman Bryon Boyle of Pennsylvania. It's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio.
This is a major undertaking. Reconciliation has been the priority for the House of Representatives so far this year, and I'm confident we will get it done. I think we can pretty easily get to $500 billion. The question is, how do we get to $880 billion, which is where I know a good section of the conference wants to be. I feel like we're going to get there. This is going to be a painful journey, but at the end of the day, it will be worth it.
That was Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska on Friday's edition of Balance of Power, discussing the internal challenges ahead for House Republicans as they try to pass President Trump's tax agenda. House Speaker Mike Johnson delayed the bill's markup in key committees until next week in the hopes of sorting out those disagreements, including potential cuts to Medicaid. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Bryon Boyle of Pennsylvania, the ranking member of the House Budget Committee. Congressman, great to have you with us, and I'd love to start by having you just react to what we heard there from your friend and colleague from across the aisle from Nebraska, talking about the difficulty of this moment. It's going to be hard for Republicans, hard for Democrats as well. So what's the Democratic strategy here as Republicans haggle over this and try to figure out a way forward?
Well, as my colleague from the Republican side of the aisle was saying, that it would be so easy to cut $500 billion from Medicaid, I would remind you that would be the largest cut to Medicaid by far in American history, a pretty massive percentage out of the program, which is the main provider of health coverage for at least 72 million Americans, including 44% of the people who live in my district. Make no mistake about it, whether it's the $500 billion in cuts to Medicaid or the full $880 billion that Republicans first passed, that would be devastating in my community and communities like mine all throughout the country.
When you're calling this devastating to your communities, you are in the minority here. So what is the Democratic plan really to stop some of this without the power?
Yeah, so Democrats may be by a few seats in the minority here, but the opinion that I just offered is certainly not in the minority. In fact, a public poll out a few weeks ago from Navigator Research showed that 81% of the American people oppose cutting Medicaid in order to subsidize tax cuts for the rich. That is exactly what the Republicans are proposing. They have already passed essentially the first half of their two-step reconciliation agenda. That's why this week and next week are so critical. And I would hope that those Republicans who call themselves moderate, especially come election time, that they listen to their constituents who by an overwhelming number do not support Medicaid cuts.
You're there on the Hill. I wonder how you and other Democrats kind of transmit or communicate that message to folks across the country and kind of push back on Republicans as well. So what's going to be the thing that makes that message of yours resonant with voters who are watching their elected leaders, be they Republicans or Democrats, approaching all this?
Well, the message that I've been delivering is basically exactly what I just said. It's the facts. It's not hyperbolic language or exaggerations. It is simply pointing out the obvious centerpiece of their plan, which is using biggest cuts to Medicaid in American history in order to subsidize tax cuts for the very rich. That is a deeply unpopular plan. There are a number of Republicans who are attempting to even deny that the Medicaid cuts are included in there, even though it's in black and white in the bill. So I think that on the Democratic side of the aisle, doing all we can to get just a few brave House Republicans to join with us and stop this bad plan from happening.
Some Republicans are hoping that they get this done by July. Realistically, what do you believe the timeline is?
Well, anytime, and I've been here now a little over a decade, anytime on a big important piece of legislation you hear the initial deadline, always be skeptical about that because it almost always slips. There have been conversation around here about it being by Memorial Day. Now some people are talking about 4th of July. I will actually give you a real hard and fast deadline. And in my view, that would be whenever the X date or the date by which we absolutely must raise the debt ceiling. We think that that's going to be in August. We should learn some point this week what that X date is. That will be the real deadline because included in the Republicans' reconciliation bill is, of course, a massive increase in the debt ceiling.
Congressman, could you pull back the curtain a little bit here? We're going to speak tomorrow with your counterpart on the Republican side, the chairman of the House Budget Committee. What is the working relationship like between the two of you, and how is that emblematic of the kind of relationship among all the committees on Capitol Hill? How much dialogue is there between Republicans and Democrats in leadership?
Yeah, so I consider Jody a good friend. He and I get along well together. We both served in these positions. He as chair and me as ranking member of the Budget Committee now for 3 years. We said on day one, our very first hearing about 2.5 years ago, that we were not interested in performative stuff or food fights. We wanted the Budget Committee to be what it ought to be, a very substantive committee. And I give him credit. He has been a good partner in that regard. Both of us have attempted to set a tone of seriousness and making sure that any policy disputes we have are vigorously argued, but on policy grounds, not personality. Now, as far as this reconciliation bill, let's face it, Republicans have no interest whatsoever in working with Democrats. They set out from the very beginning on a go-it-alone path. They have been pursuing that single-mindedly. If that path were to fail, then I think they would be left in the situation where they would have to come and work with the Democratic side. But it'll only be if and when they fail to put up the number of votes they need either in the House or Senate.
Congressman, there have been massive delays at Newark Airport. Today we learned that air traffic controllers lost radar for more than a minute. Now there's staffing problems as well. Will you be pushing for the FAA in this budget?
You know, I was actually just talking about this about 10 minutes ago with a friend. This is deeply worrying. There have been many who have been warning now for quite some months that what was happening at FAA, thanks to DOJ and this administration, the way air traffic controllers are being messed with, that would actually prompt real life consequences and very serious and dangerous ones. I think we are seeing perhaps the beginning of that today.
Do you think that your colleagues are taking this seriously? Again, so you're looking now at Newark, bleeding into Philadelphia, still conversations about the safety of DCA of Reagan Airport here. How high up on the agenda is this, kind of getting the FAA in working order?
Well, I have to tell you, as someone who flies regularly, although I'm more an Amtrak guy than a flying guy, but I do a fair number of trips on both thanks to this job. And I have to say that the last couple months, the safety issue has been in the back of my mind more and more than at any time, really since 9/11, actually. That was the last time that I was thinking about it this frequently. This is very serious. And you want to talk about a serious nonpartisan issue, it would certainly be the safety of air travel in the United States.
Democratic Congressman Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania, thank you so much for being with us. And coming up, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent discussed the state of the global economy at Milken earlier today. We'll bring you that conversation next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is a Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside David Gura. I'm Julie Fine. Earlier today, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent gave a speech at the Milken Institute Global Conference in Los Angeles, California. This is what he had to say to the room about the Trump administration's economic policies and how they will position the United States moving forward.
America is the Schelling point of global finance. We have the world's reserve currency and the deepest and most liquid capital markets and the strongest property rights. For these reasons, the United States is the premier destination for international capital, and the administration's goal is to make it even more appealing for investors like you. This morning, I will explain how we plan to achieve that goal. The primary components of the Trump economic agenda, trade, tax cuts, and deregulation, are not standalone policies. They are interlocking parts of an engine designed to drive long-term investment in the American economy. Our goal with trade policy is to level the playing field for our great American workers and companies. With a level playing field, American industry can outcompete all challengers. Tariffs are engineered to encourage companies like yours to invest directly in the United States. Hire your workers here, build your factories here, make your products here. You'll be glad you did, not only because we have the most productive workforce in the world, but because we will soon have the most favorable tax and regulatory environment as well. This is where tax incentives and deregulation come into play. You may have heard one big, beautiful bill floating around Congress. This bill is big and beautiful for Main Street America and investors alike. The president's signature tax legislation will prevent an enormous tax hike on Main Street by making the small business deduction permanent. It will also provide tax credits and deductions for research and innovation to stimulate investment in high-tech operations. It will restore 100% expensing for equipment while expanding that incentive to new factory construction. The objective, to accelerate investment in American industry. To make that investment as seamless and rewarding as possible, President Trump has embraced an ambitious deregulation agenda. This includes expansive permitting reform. The president doesn't want to just drill, baby, drill. He wants to build, baby, build. To that end, he has signed executive orders to reduce the federal approval process for new energy and construction projects from several years to just a few months. This simple reform will unleash the creative potential of America's builders. It will empower business leaders like you to put your capital to work as quickly and efficiently as possible.
You can find the full conversation with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent online or on the terminal. And Julie, stood out to me that he's there making that case to this group of high-powered executives and bankers and finance executives. Tomorrow he's going to be on Capitol Hill. I suspect he'll be asked about a lot of what he was talking about there. I
think he will. And if anybody was watching that, certainly on the Democratic side, I think they're going to have some questions about one big, beautiful bill. I also expect him to be hammered tomorrow, possibly from both sides of the aisle, about tariffs.
We'll be watching that, of course, bringing those headlines as they cross the terminal, as that hearing takes place. Coming up on the heels of our conversation with Democratic Congressman Bryon Boyle, an update from a prominent Republican about the budget process and the politics at play when GOP Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida joins us. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio.
At some point in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I'm going to be setting the deal. We're negotiating with many countries. But at the end of this, I'll set my own deals. We're meeting with almost all of them, including China. And at the end, I'm setting the deal. You keep asking the same question. When will you agree? It's up to me. It's not up to them.
That was President Trump aboard Air Force One giving a timeline on those potential tariff deals, talking about this coming together in a matter of weeks. Keep in mind, it took approximately 2 years for the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement to be finalized and signed during President Trump's first term in office. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, a measure to undo the president's global tariffs failed in the Senate just a few days ago, and Republicans in both chambers are going full steam ahead on passing a budget in line with the president's vision of remaking the federal government. Joining us now with more is Florida Congressman and gubernatorial candidate Bryon Donalds. Congressman, let me start with taxes and the budget. We can maybe move into trade here in just a little bit, but let me ask you about the timeline. We heard from Congressman Bryon Boyle, his sense of what that is. I know from Republicans we've heard Memorial Day, the 4th of July. What is your read on how fast this is moving and when we should expect some sort of agreement here among Republicans?
Well, first I will tell you, I don't think this has really moved super fast. We've been in deliberations about the elements of tax policy and also the elements of cutting mandatory spending really since November. We've been talking about this. So there's been many iterations, many conversations on Capitol Hill between members in the House, members of the Senate, between both chambers about how to put this together. So it's been a very deliberative pace. We've gotten a lot of work done. We're now in the process where a couple of our committees in the House need to finish their work, specifically Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means, so that we can bring that package to the floor. Overall, it will extend all of President Trump's tax policy. I know I heard the audio from Secretary Bessent talking about 100% expensing for 4 years. That will have monumental pro-growth impacts on the American economy. No tax on tips, overtime Social Security, like the president campaigned on, and any other features around border, around energy, and around defense. It is a broad package, but it is about getting us out of the era of subsidies and regulations under Joe Biden and into the era of private investment and economic growth under Donald Trump.
So you are calling for cuts to Medicaid. That is a red line for some, even in your own party. How do you think that you can get everyone on board to get that done, along with $1.5 trillion in other cuts?
Well, first of all, let's be very clear. If you go to the GAO report from the last several years, in Medicaid alone, there's over $50 billion of waste, fraud, and abuse every single year. The proposals we are talking about is getting the waste, fraud, and abuse out of Medicaid, something everybody should agree on. Number two, we do have a situation where currently under Medicaid, because of Obamacare, poor children, people who are disabled, they actually only get about a 50% reimbursement with state money from the federal government. But if you're an able-bodied adult who can go into the economy, get a job, earn money, and have your own health care, we reimburse at a 90% clip from the federal government. That doesn't make any sense. So it's about actually bringing that able-bodied population to be closer to be in line with poor children in America, people who are disabled and are hurting in America. That's just basic common sense. I think on a broader level, it is about lowering the cost curve here in Washington, D.C. We can't continue to borrow at the same velocity of federal bonds, because that is driving up interest rates and borrowing costs on families and on small businesses. It's not sustainable. Washington has to get the fiscal house in order.
Congressman, last week we spoke with Mick Mulvaney, and here's what he had to say about what's unique about this particular tax bill.
The bill is not a tax cut. The bill is an extension of the current tax rates. It's the prevention of a tax increase. You hear Donald Trump go on TV and say, I'm going to give you a huge tax cut. Technically, he's correct, because the current law is that your taxes are going to go up, and he's preventing that from happening. But if you were expecting more money in your wallet, if this bill passes, you are going to be extraordinarily disappointed. And that's going to be a hard sell for the Republicans.
A hard sell, he says. And Congressman, I'd love to get your reaction to that. But more broadly, I'm wondering how effectively you think the president's message is getting across to Americans. I know you went home and did a town hall. It was a bit raucous. There were some folks who were upset with your leadership and with the president's plan. Is the president successfully communicating what he's trying to do here, picking up on what Mr. Mulvaney said?
Well, the president's been consistent about everything that he's talked about. And where I disagree with Mick is when you talk about no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security, those are going to have direct benefits to people who are middle-income Americans and below. You'll see direct impact there. There will be more money in your pocket. If I'm not taxing tips, well, that means everybody who's getting tips, waiters, Uber drivers, people who are doing DoorDash, people who are doing Shipt, bringing groceries to people's homes, they all get tips. They actually will get more money in their pocket. That's a good thing. So I disagree with his assertion. If you're talking about small business taxes, if you're talking about tax rates at the upper levels, yeah, that's going to be made consistent. We're not making any changes there. But for people who are on the bottom end of the economic ladder, they're actually going to see more money in their pocket from the president's plans and the one big beautiful bill. I actually think it's an easy sell, not that difficult.
Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem today said migrants who self-deport through the CBP app will get $1,000. Now, this is an administration that has been calling for the largest deportation in history. Now they're paying people to leave the country. What does this say about the efforts?
Oh, what it says is that it is cheaper for us to pay people to go back to their own countries than to pay for them here in the United States. Understand, the cost to our country of massive illegal immigration is about $150 billion every single year. You have people who are on public assistance in some of these blue states. Crazy policy, if you ask me, but that's what's occurred. It's the cost of a lot of different situations. So getting them to leave in a voluntary manner is actually great for the United States. It helps so many of our cities and our localities not have to deal with the budgetary burdens of illegals in our country, and it helps to get us on a sound footing so you can address some of the major long-term policy issues around immigration. If there are going to be any potential visa reforms in the future, none of that can happen unless you secure the border, which Donald Trump has done. Frankly, he did it in record time. And then you get really this swath of 10 million plus illegal aliens out of the country, so local governments and state governments actually have some breathing room.
I saw a headline cross just a few moments ago, and that is Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, is saying that he needs to cut 20% of top military leadership. You sit on the Military and Foreign Affairs Subcommittee for Oversight and Government Reform. Is that something that you would endorse, a cut of 1/5 to, again, senior leadership in the U.S. military?
Well, first and foremost, obviously, the devil's always in the details, but let's not sit here and act like the Department of Defense is some lean, mean fighting machine. The thing is bloated. There is massive bureaucracy at the Pentagon. I've talked to some of my colleagues on the Hill who've done work with the Pentagon in the past, and they've all said if you actually cut 20% of the workforce, it would actually become a more efficient agency. So with where President Trump, Secretary Hegseth, and the rest of the team are going is, we need a government that is lean and efficient. It cannot continue to be bloated, inefficient, and waste billions of dollars anymore. We're borrowing that money from the future prosperity of our children. So if we have to borrow money, let's at least be efficient. If it means that we have to shrink some of the force in the bureaucracy of the Department of Defense, okay, so be it, as long as it doesn't impact the lethality of the men and women on the front lines. And I think Secretary Hegseth is doing the right thing. Let's see what the details are, but we got to be lean and efficient. That needs to be the mantra, not just today because Donald Trump is president. That needs to be where politicians and where the American people actually want the federal government to go. We can't waste money simply because everybody loves the largesse in Washington. It's simply not sustainable.
The president saying yesterday in an interview on Meet the Press that I don't know when referring to due process in the execution of the Constitution. Would you vote to impeach a president who refuses to execute the Constitution?
Okay, listen, that's a completely loaded question. What the president was talking about is he is following the advice of the White House counsel, the Attorney General, and in their team, the attorneys over at the Department of Homeland Security, when it comes to deporting criminal illegal aliens. Of course, the president is going to follow the Constitution. We just had a president who was not. He was suppressing free speech of the American people. He was spying on the words of the American people when they were against his prerogatives on COVID-19. We just had a president of the United States who, quite frankly, we don't even know if he was running the country. You have the auto pen situation. You had cabinet secretaries who were never held accountable for their terrible jobs. What Donald Trump is talking about is he has a mission to deport illegal aliens out of the country. That is a mandate from the people of this country, from the voters of this country. When it comes to following the Constitution, if you want to have a specific question for him, he is answering the question in the appropriate way, following the legal advice of the team, who, by the way, has been confirmed by the United States Senate.
Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida, thank you so much for being with us. The president calls to reopen a notorious U.S. prison. That and more up ahead. But next, how President Trump's tariffs are impacting the state of global investments in the United States. We'll discuss with Eric Pan of the Investment Company Institute next on Bloomberg Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
We suspect the volatility of the last month will lead to slower business investment, reduced capital inflows, reduced foreign investment in the U.S. That will tend to have a negative effect on growth. On the other hand, if there are trade deals, if there's changes in regulation that are pro-growth, that will go in the other direction. We have all the volatility, we have all the negative parts, and now we're waiting on the positive.
That's Philip Swagel, the director of the Congressional Budget Office, earlier today discussing the impact of tariff uncertainty on domestic and global investment. Joining us now for analysis on the state of investment in the U.S. is Eric Pan, president and CEO of the Investment Company Institute. Great to have you with us here in Washington. And I'd love to start just by picking up on what we heard there from Phil Swagel. That is, there's this overarching uncertainty. How is that manifesting itself in the decisions of, yes, institutional investors, but retail investors as well?
So there is a lot of uncertainty,
yes.
And more certainty would definitely be great. The good news is U.S. retail investors are still in the market. You know, most Americans, they invest paycheck per paycheck, and that's actually good when there's market volatility.
So you're a CEO. You talk to a lot of CEOs. What are they saying to you about the uncertainty and how it's affecting their business?
I think a lot of them are saying the same things that they would tell their investors. Long-term investing, buy and hold. Let's wait things out. Obviously, President Trump has a strategy. Let's see how it plays out.
You said investors are still invested. That's a good thing. From your vantage, what insight do you have into sort of where the money is going? What funds are popular, sort of how people are looking at the market in a kind of tangible way at this point in time? So they don't have it in cash, it sounds like. But what are the ways in which they're weathering this storm of uncertainty?
Well, actually, they're both going into equities. A lot of are going into broad-based index funds. But they're
U.S. equities.
U.S. equities.
Yeah.
They're also going into cash. Money market funds. Over $7 trillion are in money market funds, which is the record amount.
As for private equity in 401ks, has there been any interest in discussions with the White House?
There's definitely interest. This is one of the goals that we think should happen, allowing Americans through their retirement accounts to have access to private assets.
What does that look like, first of all? Then second, sort of as you kind of assess the regulatory landscape in this city and beyond, is there an appetite for that happening? How hard a sell, I guess, is what I'm asking you. Is it to get financial regulators on board with this kind of fundamental change of allowing private assets into 401ks and other retirement funds?
So I think there's a lot of support for the idea. As to how to make it happen, there remains a lot of work that needs to be done. Department of Labor, Securities and Exchange Commission, the White House, they all have to be part of the conversation.
So when you say there's a lot of work to be done, you just mentioned several different groups.
Yeah.
What kind of timeline, or are you just way too early for that?
I think it will take a couple of years probably to make it happen in reality. We have laws that need to be passed, regulations that need to be made. But what I can tell you is people are talking about it today. They're working hard on the issues today. So I'm very optimistic.
I'm going to go back to the regulation question. I'm curious how much that terrain has shifted over the last 6-9 months. So we have a new head of the SEC. Paul Atkins has been confirmed. He's now running that agency. It's not a full commission yet when you look at the SEC. Does it look different? How is the appetite different than it was under President Biden, say?
It is very different.
Yeah.
Under Chair Atkins, we have an SEC that's very supportive of the president's objective to have a pro-growth agenda. Under the past SEC, there was more hesitation to look for those types of policies. So, yes, things are very different.
You know, we did see a little bit of a rebound in April, but clearly not out of the woods yet.
Yeah.
How does that really affect the global investor?
I think what April tells us is you had this drop in the markets after Liberation Day, and now we've seen the markets recover. I think that's actually adding confidence to the market. It means that those people who stayed have actually done okay. They haven't suffered large losses. And I think, if anything, it's telling people buy, hold, invest for the long term.
There was a great note this morning from Michael Purvis of Tallback and Capital, and he said, look, if you went to Bora Bora for 3 months and didn't have your cell phone, came back today and looked at the market, you'd think nothing had happened fundamentally. We're kind of back to where we were before. On this issue, sort of what investors want, what they're hungry for, is it the White House indicating that there is a framework for a deal or a memorandum of understanding, or do they have to have something that's sort of signed in ink that's indicating that, once again, there are these bilateral agreements between countries? What notionally do they need to have to sort of feel that confidence again?
I think investors want to see trade deals made. I think they're taking a lot of confidence from what the Treasury Secretary said today at the Milken conference. I think they are very optimistic with some of the president's statements about deals are in the works. When deals are made and announced, I think you're going to see a very positive reaction from the market.
Eric Pan, President and CEO of the Investment Company Institute. Thanks so much for being with us. We appreciate your time. And coming up, President Trump is floating the idea of reopening one of the most notorious prisons in the history of the United States. We'll discuss the likelihood with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. President Trump sent Hollywood into a tizzy in the last 24 hours after announcing a 100% tariff on films produced overseas. That sent stocks tumbling today. A few hours ago, he shared that a plan to meet with the film industry is in the works. With whom and what they're going to discuss was not immediately known. Joining us now with their reaction to that and more is this evening's political panel, Bloomberg politics contributor Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Presidency and Congress, and Democratic and Republican strategist Chapin Fay, founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs. Jeannie, let me start with you. How do you react to something like we saw over the last 24 hours in this environment? We've been through a Trump presidency before. Something like this is floated. How much credence does it give you? What does it sort of tell you about sort of how legitimate a policy proposal it is by the president?
You know, it's typical with this president. It is a real problem that we don't make enough, certainly in California anymore, in terms of film and TV. That's well known. And even across the United States, somebody was saying that it's cheaper to bring a set of 100 Americans and ship them overseas and make a movie than it is to do it here. But as typical with this president, it's a problem. But the solution is we're going to tariff, right? We're not going to give tax incentives, carrots for people to come here. We're going to tariff. And in this case, we're tariffing not a good, but a service. And the complexity of doing that is amazing. So I think he's right on the problem, but the solution is very vague. In the middle of the night, we're truthing it out, and you don't really know what to make of it. But he's starting a conversation. That's good. I wish it was a more serious policy proposal.
Chapin, I do want to ask you, the president comes out with this, but then turns around and says he will be meeting with the film industry on this. What is the Republicans' best message on this? Because, again, it's like a tariff is announced, and then it's somewhat, well, maybe we'll try this.
Well, I think like a lot of President Trump's strategy, it's a negotiation tactic, right? He's highlighting, like Jeannie said, calling attention to an issue, which is that it's much cheaper to do things outside of America, right? And he's trying his best to reshore all sorts of industries, and Hollywood is an industry just like any other. There are already tax breaks in various states. New York State has one. It's a constant public affairs battle as different states try to compete with each other, but none of them can compete with foreign governments and much more attractive places to film. So I think this is a piece of the whole tariff strategy. It's going to require a little patience from Americans, but if we can get deals and we can get movies made right here in America, then that'll be a win for the president.
Jeannie, do you put this proposal to reopen as we move up the California coast to off the coast of San Francisco? This proposal to reopen Alcatraz, do you put that in the same bucket?
I don't put this in the same bucket. I do love an all-California show with you folks.
Trying.
I don't
with the Texas Bureau.
Texas twist, yeah.
I'm New York. I don't put it in the same bucket because I don't think that is a real serious proposal. This is somebody who is talking about cutting spending, the doge of it all. And yet he's going to open a prison, or he's talking about opening a prison that costs 3 times more to run than any other prison in the United States, that just to reopen would take millions, if not billions of dollars. And so I think this is the Donald Trump who likes a good prison. He likes to focus on law and order. But I have to agree with Nancy Pelosi on this one. It is just not a serious proposal. I think Gavin Newsom may have chuckled when he heard it. So I don't think this is going to be a real serious proposal.
Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Chapin Fay, thank you so much for being with us. And a reminder, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will appear before the House Appropriations Committee tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern. We'll have full coverage of the hearing right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg. We'll see you tomorrow.